Abraham Bundy was born in Cherry Grove, Illinois in 1859. Cherry Grove is so named for the many wild cherry trees located there. Abraham was the 11th of 17 children born to Isaac and Sarah Vest Bundy. 13 of their 17 children were born right here in Carroll County, Illinois. Sarah had her first child at age 19 and her 17th child at age 45. She was 37 years old when she had Abraham. She had her last 7 children over the course of 8 years.
The Isaac and Sarah Bundy family lived in Section 10 at Cherry Grove, Illinois. Their neighbor to the south was Robert L. Chitty. In 21 years' time, his niece would become the wife of Abraham Bundy.
Isaac and Sarah Bundy owned 80 acres here in Cherry Grove and called it home for 29 years. Isaac worked slaughtering sheep and for a threshing crew. On the 1860 tax assessment, as you can see, the assessor inventoried his carriage. The value of Isaac's carriage, according to this assessment, was $1.
One of Abraham's earliest memories was his brother going to fight in the Civil War. Abraham was just 4 years old, and he remembers his mother and sisters crying as Christopher left home with the 46th Infantry.
Abraham's brother Ambrose also served in the Civil War. He left home just a couple of months before Christopher. Cherry Grove is where Abraham Bundy was born and raised. Like all of us, he was born to goodly parents and was educated here secularly as well as spiritually. He started school in about 1865 with 75 other schoolmates, grades 1 through 4. He walked 1.25 miles to school each day.
I remember one recess, that is maybe one half of the school, were skating near the schoolhouse, and when the bell rang for school, I thought I would make another round around the pond. So away I sped. But when I got around, I found everybody had their skates off and were nearly all in the schoolhouse, and by the time I got mine off, I was the last one going in. I don't think I was over 2 minutes behind, but as I went in, the teacher stood by the door and came down with his old switch all over my shoulders and back. I jumped like I was shot and went to my seat. The teacher never said a word, and neither did I, and the school moved on at the same old rhythm.
The Bundy family were Christian, attended Sunday worship services, and were well read in the Bible. Abraham remembers one of his Sunday school teachers well, Mr. Jacob C. Brenner.
This is a look at what Shannon, Illinois looked like when Abraham was growing up there. When Abraham was just 5 years old, the Methodist Church was organized in Shannon under the direction of Pastor Moses G. Sheldon. It wasn't until Abraham was 9 years old that they built their first chapel.
Prior to building their own chapel and having a full-time pastor, the religious services were rendered by circuit riders that came from Galena, 51 miles to the northwest. This is probably what Grandpa Abraham looked like in 1876, at the age of 17. Isaac was working with a threshing crew, and he asked Abraham to plow the fields while he was gone. The Illinois heat and flies were terrible, and that is when Abraham decided to run away from home. Grandpa says in his autobiography,
I knew what it meant to disobey my father, and the more I thought about that, the more determined I got that I wouldn't take that either. So I decided to leave home. I had a nephew over in Iowa. I decided to go where he was. So without ever saying a word to anyone, one night I went upstairs and rolled up a little bundle of clothes and threw them out of the window and went downstairs, through the room where my mother was washing the supper dishes, and without ever saying a word went out into the night, got the bundle of clothes, and went to the nearest town.
Abraham made his way walking, riding the rails, traveling on riverboats, and eating off the land. He worked odd jobs along the way to earn his passage. Over a few months' time, Abraham made his way, a total of 555 miles, from Shannon, Illinois to Hepler, Kansas. The average temperature in Shannon, Illinois in August was about 80 degrees with 80% humidity.
Ambrose Bundy was Grandpa Abraham's oldest brother. He was 18 years older than Abraham and left home to get married when Grandpa was just 4 years old. Ambrose and his new wife moved 565 miles southwest of Cherry Grove to a township called Walnut Station, Kansas, where new land was available. Walnut was a small town of 568 people, and Hepler was an unincorporated part of Walnut, just 10 miles away. Hepler was a prominent shipping point on the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, and this is where Abraham landed in 1876.
The engineer let me ride from Fort Scott to Hepler, a distance of 20 miles for 50 cents. When I got to Hepler, I inquired to find out where my brother lived. The first man I asked said, "He's here in town." He said he's up there in the store. I went up to the store and stood around and watched him for a while. He looked right at me once but said nothing. Jake Brenner, an old Sunday school teacher of mine, was in the store. I called out and told him who I was. He was surprised and took me back in the store up to my brother and asked him if he knew who I was. He looked at me and said no, he didn't know me. Jake said, "This is your brother." He looked me over well but did not even offer to shake hands. He did not believe that I was his brother. He said that the last time he saw me, my hair was white as a sheep's. It was not as black as a raven's feathers. He told Jake that he would find out on the way home whether I was his brother or not. He said afterwards that he thought I was some bum trying to get a meal or feed off of him. But the requests he asked me and the answers I gave him convinced him that I was his brother. I stayed around and went to school that winter.
In Walnut, Kansas, Abraham went to work for George Bollinger. The Bundys knew the Bollingers from Cherry Grove, and Ambrose was married to George's sister, Margaret. After 3 months' time, Abraham worked for his brother raising plants. It was while he was living in Kansas that Abraham experienced his first real heartache.
We got a letter that stated that my niece and my mother were dead. I never had anything in my life that hurt me like that. I thought my heart would break. All the mean things I had done seemed to come to my mind with a remorse that was overwhelming to think that my mother was dead. Waves of grief came to me with such force and for such a long time that I thought it would kill me. It never occurred to me the sorrow and grief that must have gripped my mother's heart during the 6 weeks I was gone, from the time I left home until they heard from me in Kansas. Oh, my mother, can you ever forgive me for the sorrow that I have caused you? In those realms where sorrow never grips the soul, I hope to meet you and, if possible, to make what amends that I can. May my Father in heaven forgive me also.
It was here that Abraham found his true love, a strapping, speckled-faced girl from Cherry Grove, Illinois. Her name was Ella Anderson, and she had become orphaned at the age of 13. She went to live with a next-door neighbor and longtime acquaintance of the Anderson family, Ambrose and Margaret Bundy. It was here, in the home of Ambrose Bundy, that Abraham and Ella tied the knot on February 12, 1882. Then it was off to Nebraska to make themselves a home.
A couple of weeks after we were married, we left Kansas for Nebraska. We stopped in Kansas City for a couple of days visiting with Mr. Ulysses' folks. It was in February and it snowed and rained a little. The mud in the streets was 2 or 3 inches deep. It was something like soup. We came through Omaha and on up to Cozad, Nebraska. We walked up the road 3 miles to a section house where I inquired about a job and got one. I worked there until I received enough money to buy some food to last us for a while. We then went out to my homestead. I had a dugout on my homestead that was 10 by 12 feet. It was dug 2 feet in the ground and was laid up with sod. It was 4 feet high, and with the 2 feet in the ground, it was 6 feet in all. We didn't have a bedstead. All we had was a pile of straw in one corner, held in place by 2 railroad ties. As far as I can remember, we were as happy there under those circumstances as we have been since. We had 160 acres of as fine land as is laid outdoors. We were young and strong. Mama was plump, and her cheeks were like the rose.
Grandpa's home was 10 feet by 12 feet. It was dug down in the ground 2 feet, and then he would cut squares of sod and dirt and stack it up 4 feet. There was one ridge pole across the top, and smaller poles extending from that to the sod walls on the side. He got some willows down at the Platte River and laid them across the shelter poles, and then laid sod on top of that for a roof. Cozad is the alfalfa capital of the world. Abraham raised several crops and had some stock. He remembers harvesting a 14-pound turnip one year.
It rained aplenty. Mr. Claypole and Mr. Cozad put up hay along the river. It was hard to keep the hay from spoiling. I got a job helping them.
These are pages from the Willow Island assessment books. Willow Island was 5 miles east of Cozad, an unincorporated part of the county where Abraham and Ella lived.
By the time Lily was born, we had a new house up on the hill where we could see all over the valley. We could see the Union Pacific trains in sight for 10 miles. We lived there about 15 years, through drought and good and plentiful years. One time I had stock land that I could have sold out for $4,000. We had good neighbors. Life went on smoothly. We never had any trouble.
We never had any trouble. That is, until my brother Will brought a Mormon elder to our place. Up until that time, I had never seen a Mormon. I was around 35 years old. If I had been going to travel the world over to find out which church was right, the Mormons would have been the last place I would have looked. I had never heard anything in my life but contempt for the Mormons.
Two missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints brought a message to the Bundy family in 1893. They boarded for a short time with the Bundy family, and Ella was quick to accept their message. The neighbors called her crazy and couldn't believe that Abraham would allow her to believe in such things. They wouldn't help Abraham thrash his field, and even his sister would call him a disgrace to the family.
Things became so difficult for the family that they packed their belongings, 2 covered wagons, gathered their horses, 10 of them that is, and a bunch of chickens, and headed west, practically giving their land and home away. They stopped for a season in western Kansas before continuing west to northern Utah, where Abraham was baptized a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This was only the beginning of several moves the Bundy family would make before laying down roots at Mount Trumbull, Arizona, otherwise known as Bundyville. Abraham was 36 years old and Ella was 30 years old when they and their 5 children left everything they had ever known. They would only return once in 1939 for a visit. Abraham and Ella were born and raised on the prairie, and now they were destined to make their home in the mountains.